The saloon in Dry Creek was thick with smoke, whiskey, and bad intentions. Luke Morrison sat at the poker table, his hat tipped low, a bottle of rye half empty at his elbow. He'd been riding cattle trails for months, pockets light, pride even lighter. Tonight he was chasing luck he didn't have. Across from him sat Clayton Briggs, rancher, cattle baron, and the kind of man who smiled only when he was ruining someone. The cards slapped the table, coins clinked, and the crowd leaned in. Luke's hands were steady, but his mind was clouded. He didn't notice Briggs' sly glances to the dealer. The stakes climbed higher. First Luke's saddle, then his horse, then the deed to a small patch of land. And still, he stayed in the game. Finally, Briggs leaned forward, his voice dripping with mockery. "One last hand, Morrison. Win, and you get it all back. Lose, and you marry the woman I choose." The saloon erupted in laughter. Luke's jaw tightened. He thought it was just another cruel joke. But pride, that dangerous thing, made him nod. The cards were dealt. Luke's heart pounded. He turned over his hand, and the room went silent. Briggs grinned like a wolf. "Boys," Briggs said, standing, "meet the bride, Amara Johnson." From the back of the saloon, she stepped forward, tall, proud, with eyes that could cut through stone. A black widow who'd been fighting Briggs in court for her late husband's land. The crowd's laughter turned to whispers. This wasn't just a marriage. It was a public humiliation for them both. Luke's stomach dropped. Amara's gaze locked on his, not with fear, but with a fire that said she'd rather face a firing squad than be anyone's pawn. And in that moment, Luke realized this bet wasn't just about him. It was about to change both their lives forever. The next morning, the town of Dry Creek woke to the sound of church bells, not for a wedding of love, but for a spectacle. Word had spread overnight like prairie fire. Luke Morrison, the down-on-his-luck cowboy, was to marry Amara Johnson, the black widow who'd been a thorn in Clayton Briggs' side for months. The church was packed, not with friends or family, but with gawkers, ranch hands, and saloon drifters eager to see humiliation dressed up in the Sunday clothes. Briggs sat in the front pew, boots polished, hat in his lap, grinning like a man who'd already won. Luke stood at the altar, jaw tight, eyes fixed on the door. He'd barely slept. The whiskey haze from the night before had burned away, leaving only the bitter taste of regret. He wasn't a man who feared much. Not bullets, not storms, but the thought of chaining someone else to his mistakes made his stomach twist. Then the doors opened. Amara stepped in, wearing a simple cream dress that had seen better days, but she wore it like armor. Her chin was high, her gaze steady. She didn't look at the crowd. She didn't look at Briggs. She looked straight at Luke, and in that moment he saw it. Not fear, not shame, but defiance. The preacher's voice droned on, but Luke barely heard it. His mind was racing. He knew Briggs's game now. This wasn't just about embarrassing Luke. This was about breaking Amara. Briggs had been trying to buy her land for months, sending threats, cutting off her water supply, even hiring men to scare her off. She'd stood her ground every time. Now, by forcing her into this marriage, Briggs thought he'd finally cornered her. When the vows came, Amara's voice was steady, but her words were clipped, like each one was a bullet she was loading into a chamber. Luke's own voice was low, almost reluctant, but there was a flicker of something else, a silent promise he didn't yet understand. The preacher pronounced them man and wife. The crowd erupted in laughter and whispers. Briggs tipped his hat mockingly. Outside, the sun was blinding. Luke offered his arm. Amara didn't take it. They walked side by side, silent, the dust swirling around their boots. Halfway down the steps, she stopped. "I don't know what kind of man you are, Morrison," she said, her voice low but sharp. "But I'll tell you this. I'm not your enemy. And if you think I'm going to roll over and let Briggs take what's mine, you're dead wrong." Luke studied her for a long moment. He'd seen plenty of people broken by Briggs. Amara wasn't one of them. "Then maybe," he said slowly, "we ought to stop fighting each other and start fighting him." Her eyes narrowed, measuring him. Then just barely she nodded. From the saloon balcony across the street, Briggs watched them, a cigar between his teeth. He didn't hear their words, but he saw the way they stood. Not as strangers anymore, but as something far more dangerous. And in that moment, the cattle baron realized his little game might have just birthed an alliance that could burn his empire to the ground. The wind that afternoon carried the smell of dust and rain, a strange mix that made the air heavy, like the land itself was holding its breath. Luke and Amara rode side by side down the narrow trail toward her ranch, the silence between them thick but not empty. It was the silence of two people measuring each other, deciding if the other was worth trusting. Amara's ranch sat on a stretch of land that rolled out toward the horizon, dotted with mesquite trees and framed by the jagged teeth of distant mountains. The house was small but sturdy, its white paint weathered by years of sun and wind. A barn leaned slightly to one side, and a corral stood empty. The livestock she once had were gone, sold off to pay debts or stolen by men who thought a widow couldn't fight back. Luke swung down from his horse, boots crunching on the dry earth. He could see the signs of sabotage everywhere. The broken fence posts, the water troughs tipped over, the barn door hanging by one hinge. This wasn't neglect. This was a message. "Briggs's men?" Luke asked, scanning the horizon. Amara dismounted without looking at him. "Who else?" she said flatly. "They come at night. Cut my fences. Poison my well. Leave dead coyotes on my porch so I know they've been here." Luke's jaw tightened. He'd seen this kind of slow war before. The kind that didn't start with bullets, but with fear. And fear, if left to grow, could hollow a person out from the inside. They spent the next hours working in silence, mending fences, righting the troughs, clearing debris. Luke noticed the way Amara moved. Efficient, uncomplaining, her hands calloused from years of work. She wasn't the kind of woman who waited for rescue. She was the kind who fought until there was nothing left to fight with. By the time the sun dipped low, painting the sky in streaks of gold and crimson, they were both covered in dust and sweat. Luke was about to suggest they head inside when he caught movement at the edge of the property. 3 riders, silhouettes against the dying light. "Company," Luke muttered. Amara followed his gaze. Her hand went to the rifle leaning against the porch. "Briggs's men," she said, her voice low but steady. The riders didn't bother hiding their approach. They came at a slow trot, grinning like they were already in control. The one in front, a wiry man with a scar running from his ear to his jaw, reined in his horse just short of the porch. "Evening, Mrs. Morrison," he drawled, the name dripping with mockery. "Heard you got yourself a new husband. Thought we'd come by and welcome him." Luke stepped forward, his hand resting casually on the butt of his revolver. "You've said your hello. Now turn your horses around." The man's grin widened. "Or what? You'll shoot us? Folks might not take kindly to a newlywed spilling blood on his first day." Luke didn't blink. "Try me." The standoff stretched, the only sound the creak of saddle leather and the distant cry of a hawk. Then the man spat in the dirt, turned his horse, and rode off with the others. But Luke knew this wasn't over. That was just the first probe, a test to see how far they could push. When the riders were gone, Amara lowered her rifle but didn't relax. "They'll be back," she said. Luke nodded. "Then we'll be ready." That night the storm finally broke. Rain hammered the roof, wind howled through the cracks in the shutters. Luke sat at the kitchen table, cleaning his revolver by lamplight. Amara moved quietly around the room, checking the locks, setting a second rifle by the door. For the first time since the wedding, Luke spoke without the edge in his voice. "You've been fighting him alone for a long time." Amara paused, her back to him. "Long enough to know the law won't help me, and long enough to know I can't win this by playing fair." Luke looked at her, really looked at her. The set of her shoulders, the way her eyes burned even in the dim light. He realized then that this marriage, forced as it was, had put him in the middle of something bigger than his own pride. And maybe, just maybe, it was a fight worth staying for. Outside, the rain washed the dust from the land. But Luke knew it wouldn't wash away the trouble that was coming. Trouble was already on the trail, and it was riding hard. The rain had stopped by midnight, but the land still smelled of wet earth and mesquite. The moon hung low, a pale coin in a sky streaked with ragged clouds. Luke sat on the porch, his chair tilted back, rifle across his lap. He wasn't a man who trusted quiet nights. They had a way of turning loud without warning. Inside, the lamp in the kitchen still burned. Amara was at the table, maps and papers spread before her. She was tracing the property lines with her finger, muttering under her breath. Luke had learned in the past 2 days that she didn't waste words, but when she spoke, every syllable carried weight. "You've been thinking about this fight for a long time," Luke said without turning. "I've been living it," she replied. "Every fence post I replace, every calf I lose, every bucket of water I haul from the creek because my well's been poisoned. That's all part of it. Briggs doesn't just want my land, he wants me gone. And he's patient." Luke shifted his gaze to the dark horizon. "Patience cuts both ways." They didn't get to say more. A faint metallic clink carried on the wind, the sound of a spur brushing against a stirrup. Luke's chair came down hard. He stood scanning the tree line. Another sound followed, the soft whinny of a horse, quickly hushed. "They're here," Luke said. Amara was already moving. She blew out the lamp, plunging the house into darkness. The only light now came from the moon, silvering the wet ground. Luke stepped off the porch, boots silent in the mud, and crouched behind the water trough. His eyes adjusted, shapes emerging from the shadows. 4 riders moving slow, keeping low in their saddles. They dismounted at the edge of the corral. One carried a coil of rope, another a crowbar. Luke's gut tightened. They weren't here to scare, they were here to destroy. He waited until they were halfway to the barn before he spoke. "You boys lost?" The men froze. One turned toward the sound, his hand going to his hip. Luke stepped into the moonlight, rifle leveled. "I said, you lost?" The leader, a broad-shouldered man with a beard like wire, sneered. "We're just paying a visit." Friendly-like. "Friendly visits don't happen at midnight," Luke said, "and they don't come with crowbars." From the porch, Amara's voice cut through the night. "You've got 10 seconds to turn around before I put a bullet in the first man who moves." The men laughed, but it was a nervous sound. One of them spat in the dirt. "You think you can scare us, lady?" "No," Amara said. "I think I can kill you." The standoff stretched, the air thick with the smell of wet leather and gun oil. Then the leader made his choice. He lunged for his revolver. The night exploded. Luke's rifle cracked, the shot echoing off the hills. The leader's hat flew from his head as he stumbled back, cursing. Amara's rifle barked from the porch, splintering the handle of the crowbar. The men scattered, diving for cover behind the corral fence. Bullets tore through the night, splintering wood, kicking up mud. Luke dropped behind the trough, working the lever of his rifle, firing, reloading, firing again. Amara moved like she'd been born with a rifle in her hands, her shots precise, controlled. One of the attackers broke for his horse. Luke's bullet caught the saddle horn, sending the animal rearing. The man tumbled into the mud, scrambling to his feet only to find Amara's rifle aimed square at his chest. "Tell Briggs," she said coldly, "that this land is mine, and if he wants it, he'll have to bury me to take it." The man's eyes darted to Luke, then back to Amara. He nodded once, then ran for the tree line, disappearing into the dark. The others followed, their retreat a chaotic scramble of hooves and curses. Silence returned, broken only by the drip of water from the eaves. Luke lowered his rifle, breathing hard. Amara stepped down from the porch, her dress hem soaked in mud. "You shoot well," Luke said. "I've had practice," she replied. They stood there for a moment, the adrenaline still humming between them. Luke realized something then. This wasn't just about defending a ranch. This was about drawing a line in the dirt and daring the world to cross it. And Briggs would cross it. Somewhere out there, in the dark, the cattle baron was already planning his next move. And Luke knew it wouldn't be another midnight raid. The next time Briggs came, he'd bring more men, more guns, and no intention of leaving anyone alive. The days after the midnight raid were a strange kind of quiet, the kind that doesn't bring peace, only the sense that something is coiling tighter in the shadows. Luke and Amara worked the ranch like nothing had changed, but both knew the truth. Briggs wouldn't let the humiliation stand. He'd come back, and when he did, it wouldn't be with 4 men in the dark. It would be with an army. On the third morning, Luke found the sign, a single cattle skull, bleached white, mounted on a fence post at the edge of the property. A strip of red cloth fluttered from its horns. It was an old cattleman's warning, a promise of blood. Luke took it down without a word, but Amara saw the way his jaw clenched. "When?" she asked. "Soon," he said. That night they sat at the kitchen table, a lantern between them, the map spread out again. Luke traced the ridges and gullies around the ranch with a calloused finger. "He'll come from the south. Open ground. He'll want to ride in fast, overwhelm us before we can think." Amara leaned forward. "Then we make him think. We slow him down. We make this land fight for us." They worked until the lantern burned low. By dawn, the ranch was no longer just a home. It was a fortress. Fences were reinforced with barbed wire. Trenches were dug along the southern approach. The barn doors were braced from the inside. And in the loft, Luke set up a long rifle with a clear view of the open ground. The morning of the attack came with a sky the color of old pewter. The air was heavy, still. Even the birds were silent. Luke stood on the porch, his rifle in hand, watching the horizon. Amara was beside him, her hair tied back, her eyes hard. Then they came. First the dust, a low rolling cloud on the southern plain. Then the sound, the distant thunder of hooves. And finally the riders themselves, black shapes against the pale sky, spreading out in a wide arc. At their head rode Clayton Briggs, his coat flapping, his hat pulled low, a shotgun resting across his saddle. Luke's voice was calm. Positions. Amara slipped into the barn, her rifle ready. Luke moved to the loft, settling behind the long gun. Through the scope, he could see Briggs's face, that same smug grin, but tighter now, like a man who knows he's about to get his hands dirty. The first wave hit the barbed wire and slowed. Horses reared, men cursed. Luke fired, the crack of the rifle splitting the air. One rider tumbled from his saddle, another's hat spun into the dirt. Amara's shots came from the barn, precise and unhurried, each one finding its mark. Briggs' men regrouped, fanning out, trying to flank the ranch. But the trenches forced them into narrow channels, easy targets for Luke's steady aim. The air filled with the smell of gunpowder and the sharp metallic tang of blood. Then Briggs made his move. He spurred his horse hard, breaking through the chaos, heading straight for the porch. Luke swung the rifle toward him, but a shot from the flank forced him to duck. By the time he looked again, Briggs was off his horse, charging up the steps. Amara met him at the door. He swung the shotgun like a club, but she ducked, driving her shoulder into his chest. They crashed into the wall, the shotgun clattering to the floor. Briggs grabbed her by the throat, shoving her back, but she drove her knee into his gut, breaking his grip. Luke was there a heartbeat later, tackling Briggs to the ground. The two men rolled in the dirt, fists flying. Briggs was strong, but Luke fought like a man with nothing left to lose. A punch split Briggs's lip, another sent him sprawling. He scrambled for the shotgun, but Amara kicked it away, the barrel skidding into the mud. Breathing hard, Luke stood over him. "This ends now." Briggs spat blood. "You think you've won? This land will be mine." One way or another, Amara stepped forward, her voice like steel. "Not while I'm breathing." For a long moment, the three of them stood in the rain of dust and gun smoke. The world narrowed to the space between them. Then Briggs looked at Luke, at Amara, and something in his eyes shifted. Not fear, but the realization that he'd underestimated them both. He got to his feet slowly, wiping his mouth. "This ain't over," he said, but his voice lacked its old certainty. He turned, whistled for his horse and rode off, his men following in a ragged retreat. The silence that followed was almost deafening. Luke and Amara stood side by side, watching the dust cloud fade into the horizon. The ranch was scarred, fences broken, the barn pocked with bullet holes, but it still stood, and so did they. That evening, as the sun dipped low and painted the land in gold, Luke sat on the porch, a mug of coffee in his hands. Amara joined him, lowering herself into the chair beside his. "You could have left," she said quietly, "after the wedding, after the first raid. You didn't have to stay." Luke looked out at the land. Her land, their land now, and shook his head. "Some fights are worth staying for." She studied him for a moment, then nodded. "Then I guess we're in this together." The wind shifted, carrying the scent of rain and mesquite. Somewhere in the distance, a coyote called. Luke glanced at Amara, and for the first time since that night in the saloon, he saw her smile. Small, but real. The war with Briggs wasn't over, but tonight they'd won. And in the Wild West, sometimes that was enough.